The reservation slip didn't have a name, just the word West written in black ink, no address, no phone number, no email. Room 6. Paid 2 nights in cash. I didn't think much of it at the time. We got the occasional wanderer in the winter months, quiet folks passing through before the deep freeze. But I still remember the way the man walked down the hallway that night. His boots left no sound on the carpet. And when I looked back at the guest log later, that name was gone. Let me know where you're listening from tonight and if you've ever stayed somewhere that didn't feel quite empty, even when it looked like it was. My name's Dana Ellis. I was 37 when this happened, working full-time at a mountain lodge in central Colorado. It wasn't fancy, more of a rustic winter getaway, with creaky floors, wood-burning stoves, and a coffee pot that never quite worked right. I'd moved there after a divorce, figuring the quiet might be good for me. And it was for a while. Most nights were peaceful, just me, Len, the maintenance guy, and maybe 2 or 3 guests if the snow didn't scare them off. The lodge sat about 5 miles off the main road, tucked beneath a ridge of pines. During storms, it felt like the whole world disappeared behind the curtain of snow. No cell reception, no passing traffic, just wind and the low hum of the old heating system groaning in the walls. That February, we had a week-long blizzard roll in one of those that closes everything and turns the mountains into a muffled white void. That's when he checked in. Room 6, no bags, no conversation, just a name that may or may not have ever been there. It was a Thursday evening, maybe 6:30, and the snow had been coming down steady since morning. Most of our reservations had canceled by then, which was expected. We had just 2 rooms booked that night, one family up from Pueblo, and another walk-in who came in without a reservation. He was tall, not unusually so, but tall enough that I noticed. Late 40s, I'd guess. Wore a tan canvas jacket that looked a little too clean for the storm and black boots with no snow on them. His cheeks weren't red from the cold. No scarf, no hat, no gloves. I remember thinking maybe he'd parked close, but we didn't have any cars in the lot except for mine and Len's old pickup. When I asked how I could help him, he didn't speak right away, just looked at the counter for a long moment. Then he slid a $100 bill toward me. "Room for 2 nights," he said. His voice was low but oddly flat. No particular accent, no warmth or discomfort, just a statement. I started the check-in process, asked for his ID. He said he didn't have it on him. Lost it. Normally, that would have been a deal-breaker, but the roads were buried and the lodge policy let us accept cash walk-ins if we had an emergency situation. He didn't give a name, so I wrote West on the reservation card, thinking maybe it was a last name. I offered him a key and pointed down the hall toward room 6. He didn't ask about the Wi-Fi or breakfast hours or anything else guests usually do. Just took the key, nodded, and walked off down the hallway. There was something strange about the way he moved. Not unsteady or threatening, just weightless. The carpets in the lodge were old and soft, but even Len's footsteps made them creak. This man moved without a sound, like someone who'd practiced being invisible. About an hour later, I brought him a space heater. Room 6 had a draft we hadn't been able to fix yet, and I didn't want anyone freezing. I knocked gently, waited. No response. I knocked again, a little louder. Still nothing. I was about to walk away when I heard movement, not footsteps, just a faint shift like someone adjusting their weight behind the door. Then came the voice. "It's fine." Same flat tone. Quiet, but perfectly clear. I said all right and left the heater outside the door just in case. That night, the wind rattled the windows so hard I thought they might break. I was on the lobby couch with a blanket watching old weather reports on the tiny TV. Around 1:40 a.m., I went to check the boiler room. It's down a narrow corridor that runs past the guest rooms. As I walked by room 6, I noticed something. The door was slightly open. Just a crack, but enough to see that the lights were off inside. I hesitated. I thought maybe he'd stepped out to use the restroom, but the shared bathrooms were in the opposite direction. I gave a soft knock on the door frame and said, "Everything all right in there?" No answer. I nudged the door open an inch more. The room was completely dark except for the orange glow of the baseboard heater. The space heater I'd left was still outside in the hallway untouched. I couldn't see anyone in the bed, couldn't even see a dent in the blanket, but I swear I felt someone in there. Not a presence in the supernatural sense, just the unmistakable feeling that a person was in the room holding, still watching. I pulled the door closed without stepping in. Maybe it was just nerves. Maybe I was overtired. But when I got back to the lobby, I made a note in the log room 6 door ajar. No visible occupant. Heater untouched. I told myself I'd mention it to Len in the morning, except Len never saw the guy. The next afternoon, the storm finally eased up. I asked Len to do a quick check of the rooms before the next guests arrived. I was behind the front desk when he came back and said, "You sure we had someone in room 6? I said yes. I still had the key slip. West 2 nights. Paid cash. Len shook his head. Room's clean, sheets folded, no trash, heater's still outside, doesn't even look like anyone stepped inside. I pulled up the logbook. The slip was gone. The folder we use for cash payments, nothing under W. No $100 bill in the drawer. It was like the transaction had never happened. I asked the family in room 2 if they'd seen anyone else around. They said no. In fact, they mentioned that it felt eerie being the only guests there. But I know he was real. I remember his voice. I remember writing that name. I remember that door cracked open in the dark. The security camera in the lobby only works intermittently during storms, but I checked the footage anyway. Most of it was static. But there's a 10-second clip, time-stamped 6:28 p.m., where I'm at the front desk standing alone. I'm handing a key across the counter, but there's no one across from me, just empty space. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those memories that makes people look at you differently, like they're trying to measure whether what you said could be real or if you've just spent too much time in the dark. Back in 2019, I was the overnight manager at a freight warehouse on the edge of Allentown. We processed inventory for a big box chain, long aisles of shelving forklifts, humming past the air, always a little too cold, even in summer. I'd taken the job after my divorce, when I couldn't sleep anyway, and needed something that paid enough to cover my one bedroom and keep my mind off things. Night shifts have their own rhythm. The world feels slower, quieter. But there's also this space, this stillness that creeps in around the edges, if you let it. That particular week, we'd brought in a new guy named Wesley. Quiet, maybe mid-20s, fresh out of some trade school in Reading. He was respectful, soft-spoken, didn't push back when I gave him floor assignments. There was something off about him, though. Not in any obvious way he did the job fine, didn't complain, but he had this blankness about him, like he was always halfway through listening to something I couldn't hear. The building was a converted paper mill built sometime in the 40s. Big concrete walls, narrow offices along the catwalks, and a layout that didn't always make sense. We'd had complaints about lights flickering in Sector 3 near the loading bay we only used for overflow. Maintenance hadn't found anything wrong with the wiring, so I chalked it up to age. Wesley asked to switch to that section one night, said it was quieter and he liked working alone. I said, fine. The next shift, I found him standing completely still at the edge of the pallet aisles, just staring down toward the metal garage doors. No clipboard in hand, no gloves, not even pretending to stack anything. I asked if he was all right, and he turned like he'd forgotten I was there. He nodded, said, fine, and went back to scanning inventory. I didn't push. Everyone handles night shifts differently. Then about 4 days into his first week, something changed. He stopped using the break room, wouldn't touch the coffee. When I offered him a granola bar, he just stared at the wrapper like he didn't recognize what it was. I remember joking, "You allergic to peanuts or just afraid of processed sugar?" He gave me this half smile, like he knew what the right reaction should be, but wasn't sure how to get there. It was the following night that I started to hear things. I was making rounds just after 2:00 a.m. Clipboard in hand, walking the line of inventory near receiving. That section has a motion sensor light system, so as you move the lights overhead, click on in sequence. Except that night, they were already on when I got there. All of them. The entire corridor lit up bright as day, like someone had walked it already. But I hadn't seen anyone pass. I turned the corner near the restrooms and heard something. Not footsteps exactly, more like a wet, shuffling sound. The kind you might hear if someone were dragging a heavy tarp along concrete. I called out, thinking it was one of the temp guys, maybe moving pallets the wrong way. But there was no response, just the sound fading around the next bend. When I followed it, the hallway was empty. The light above receiving flickered, then steadied. That same night I passed Wesley near the fire exit. He didn't say anything, just stood there facing the wall, his back to me, his hands at his sides. I asked if he needed anything, and he didn't respond. I started to walk closer, thinking maybe he had earbuds in. But before I reached him, he turned and walked away, heading into the loading bay without a word. I let him go. Maybe I shouldn't have. The next shift, Wesley didn't show up. I checked the log, no clock in. I called the number on his intake form and got voicemail. Figured maybe he'd quit without saying anything, which wouldn't be the first time. Still, I made a note and sent a message to HR. But around 300 that morning, one of the other workers, Jimmy mid-50s, been with the company forever, called me over. He said someone had shut off the lights in Sector 3 manually, not a motion sensor failure. The breaker had been flipped. I followed him down to the panel room. Sure enough, the switch for that sector had been pulled. Only authorized staff could do that, and Wesley wouldn't have access. We flipped the breaker back on. As the overhead lights hummed and blinked to life, something caught my eye near the rear bay door. A small piece of paper tucked into the edge of a pallet. I pulled it free. It was a warehouse inventory slip, blank except for 2 words, handwritten in black ink. I remember. That's all it said. I asked Jimmy if he'd seen anyone near the bay earlier. He shook his head, said the whole area had been dead quiet all night. The next morning, I reviewed the overnight security footage. We only had cameras in a few places, hallways, dock entries, some of the back corridors. I queued up the footage between midnight and 4:00 a.m. At exactly 2:47 a.m., one of the hallway cameras near receiving caught a frame of movement. A person walking slowly down the middle of the corridor. No uniform, no ID badge. The face was obscured, blurred somehow by motion. But the timestamp and direction matched the shuffling sound I'd heard the night before. They moved past the camera, paused at the corner, and turned toward Sector 3. But here's the thing that chilled me. They didn't trigger the motion lights. The next camera just 30 feet ahead stayed dark the entire time. I called the non-emergency police line, explained what happened, what I saw. The officer on duty, Brewster I think his name was, came by an hour later. He watched the footage twice. Then he asked to see our employee files. I pulled them up, gave him Wesley's info. Brewster frowned and asked me to spell the last name. Then he asked again when we'd hired him. I could see something shift in his expression. He asked to make a call. After a long pause outside, he came back in and told me that Wesley Dawson had died 3 years earlier. Car accident on I-78, single vehicle, black ice. He'd been 22. They'd never recovered the vehicle. I didn't know what to say. I pulled the intake file again. The form had his name. Address, emergency, contact. All things I remembered checking when I signed him in. But the printout was different now. The name field was blank. The phone number was incomplete. The emergency contact section said N.A. That slip of paper, the one with I remember on it, I'd left it on my desk while Brewster made his call. When I returned, it was gone. We never had another problem with the lights. No more shuffling sounds. No strange behavior from new hires. But I stopped walking the back corridors alone. I started keeping the breakers locked even if it meant violating protocol. There's something about night work, how it wears down the edges between memory and presence. Sometimes I wonder if Wesley ever worked there at all, or if something else did, something trying to remember what it used to be. Back in 2004, I lived on the edge of Denver, just inside the sprawl where suburbia starts to fray into warehouse parks and old railroad lines. I was 16, a junior in high school, still too young to drive legally, but old enough to think I could handle the world. Our neighborhood was the kind with quiet streets and trimmed lawns, the kind where the biggest worry was whose dog was digging up flower beds, or whether someone's kid broke a sprinkler head. Things didn't really happen where we lived, not until they did. It started in November, right when the clocks changed, and the evenings began sinking into full dark by 5. My dad worked nights driving a regional route out toward Cheyenne, and my mom worked retail at a strip mall about 15 minutes away. So most weeknights around dinner time, I'd be home alone for a few hours. That was never a problem. I knew how to microwave lasagna, keep the doors locked, and not do anything stupid. But that Monday evening, I remember something felt off before anything even happened. I couldn't tell you why exactly. Just this tension in the air, like waiting for thunder that never came. I'd finished some homework and was watching TV in the living room with the lights off. The only light came from the screen, and the porch lamp outside filtering through the curtains. That part of the block was dead quiet as usual. No dogs barking, no cars passing, not even a breeze against the siding. I was halfway through a commercial when I noticed headlights sweep slowly across the living room wall. They weren't fast like someone turning around. They moved slow, deliberate. I got up and peeked through the curtains just in time to see a white panel van rolling past the house at maybe 10 miles an hour. No markings, no windows in the back. Just one of those generic vans you see used for plumbing or electrical work. It kept moving down the block and disappeared behind the corner house. Nothing illegal about that, but something about how it moved made my stomach tighten. It didn't feel like someone who was lost or looking for an address. It felt like someone who already knew the street. I let the curtain fall and sat back down. A few minutes later, the power went out. No warning, no flickering. Just the quiet snap of everything stopping. The TV died. The fridge clicked off. The little nightlight in the hallway went dark. I stood up and looked outside again. The porch light was out, but the houses across the street were still glowing. The neighbors' Christmas lights blinked steadily, their blue and red reflections still shimmering on the wet sidewalk. Only our house had gone dark. I felt a sudden drop in temperature. Not a huge one, just enough to notice. Enough that the hairs on my arms stood up. I backed away from the window, heart pounding now, and reached for the cordless phone on the kitchen wall. I dialed my mom's work line and waited. 2 rings, 3. Then someone picked up and said she was with a customer and would call me right back. I said, okay, hung up and turned around just in time to see the van again. It had circled back and was now parked across the street, engine idling. No headlights this time, just sitting there in the dark. I crouched near the window, trying to stay low, and watched. After a minute or two, the driver's door opened, and someone stepped out. I couldn't see much, just a silhouette, tall, wide-shouldered, wearing something bulky like a winter coat with the hood up. He walked slowly to the back of the van and opened the doors. Another person stepped out, then a third. All of them moved like they were on the same beat, no talking, no flashlights, just shapes shifting silently in the dark. I backed away from the window, now fully panicked, and grabbed the phone again. This time, I called 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. I told her what I was seeing, gave her the address, and she said officers were on their way. She asked if I could see any weapons. I said no. Just people standing outside the van. Now, 2 of them were walking slowly across the street, straight toward our house. I whispered that into the phone, crouching by the kitchen counter. She told me to stay calm, stay quiet, and get somewhere safe in the house if I could. I hung up and ran to the upstairs hallway, locking myself in the bathroom. From the small window above the tub, I could just barely see the street. The 2 figures were standing in our driveway now, one of them looking toward the house, the other crouched near the front steps. I don't know what they were doing, maybe checking the locks, maybe just waiting. Then the back porch light came on. Just the porch light, nothing else in the house. The figures didn't flinch, didn't look surprised. It was like they'd been expecting it. Then the bathroom light flickered and came back on, followed by the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the low glow of hallway lights returning. Power restored. I waited another full minute before unlocking the bathroom door. I crept back down the stairs, moving slowly, afraid to make noise. I glanced out the living room window again. The van was gone. I don't mean they got in and drove off. I didn't hear tires. I didn't see brake lights. One moment they were there. The next, nothing. About 10 minutes later, a cruiser rolled slowly down the block and pulled into our driveway. A uniformed officer stepped out Sergeant Williams, according to his badge, and walked the perimeter with a flashlight. He didn't find anything. No footprints, no tire tracks, not even a mark on the snow-damp grass. He was kind, but you could tell he thought it was a teenage overreaction. Probably a delivery van that got lost, he said. Or someone doing late-night contract work. I knew better. I told my parents when they got home, and they installed motion lights and new locks the next day. But nothing ever happened again. No break-ins, no vans, no unexplained power outages. Still, I check the street more than I used to, especially on cold nights when the power flickers. And I've never forgotten that quiet moment right before the light came back on, when those figures stood completely still in the dark waiting, like they'd done it before, like they knew exactly when the house would turn back on. I don't usually travel alone. It's not fear exactly, just habit. But in the fall of 2022, I booked a last-minute stay in a little coastal town in South Carolina, hoping a change of scenery would snap me out of the burnout I'd been dragging around all year. I'd just wrapped a long freelance project, one of those jobs that bleeds into your sleep, and I needed a break. Something quiet. The Airbnb was a single-story cottage 2 blocks from the beach. White wood siding, green shutters, and a screened-in porch with 2 rocking chairs that creaked when the wind blew through. It belonged to a retired woman named Miss Ruth, who lived next door. She met me when I pulled in, holding a mason jar of iced tea and wearing a wide straw hat like something out of a Southern postcard. She gave me a quick rundown. Keys were under the frog statue. If I ever locked myself out, no parties. And try not to feed the raccoons if I saw them at night. The place had charm. Old photos on the walls, faded rugs over creaky floorboards, and that faint salt air smell that clings to anything close to the ocean. I unpacked, opened the windows to let in the breeze, and sat on the porch as dusk came in, just listening to the rustle of palm fronds and the faint slap of waves in the distance. That first night was uneventful. I slept hard, lulled by the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional croak of frogs outside. It was the second night when things shifted. Around 1:30 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. No sound, no movement. Just that instant alertness you get when your body registers something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. I lay there for a moment, breathing slowly, listening. Then I heard a single creak from the porch boards outside the bedroom window. Not the kind the wind makes, not random. Just one sharp, weight-bearing step, then nothing. I sat up slowly, heart already beating harder than it should have. The blinds were drawn, and I didn't want to lift them. I waited, listened. Another creak closer this time, near the porch door. The cottage didn't have a security system, but it did have a deadbolt, and I knew I'd locked it before bed. I stood up as quietly as I could and crossed the room, grabbing my phone. No signal, just one bar and no connection. I opened the weather app anyway, just to trigger some kind of activity, and the screen froze. Then the fan above me clicked off. The room went still. Power outage, I thought. Maybe a breaker. But the porch light was still on. I could see its glow through the bottom of the curtain. Someone was out there. I eased into the hallway, moving toward the kitchen. There was a small window above the sink that looked onto the porch. I kept the lights off and ducked slightly to avoid casting a silhouette. I peeked out. A man stood just beyond the screen door, not moving, facing the house. I couldn't see his face. He wore a brown jacket, hands in his pockets. He wasn't trying to open the door. He was just waiting. I stepped back and considered calling out, asking what he wanted. But something about how still he was, how intentional, made me stay silent. After maybe a minute, he stepped back, turned, and walked off the porch into the dark. I stayed up until morning, all the lights on now, watching through the front window. But he didn't come back. The next day, I walked to the gas station a few blocks away, told the clerk what I'd seen. He didn't look surprised, just said, "Y'all keep your doors locked around here, especially if you're staying in one of Ruth's places." When I asked what that meant, he shrugged. "Ruth's sweet and all, but she's too trusting. That unit's been broken into before. Few years back, a couple left early after someone got in through the bathroom window." I nodded, bought a coffee, and walked back slower than before. That night, I pushed the dresser in front of the door, slept with the lamp on and a flashlight within reach. No sounds, no creaks. But in the morning, I noticed something strange. The frog statue outside had been turned around. It now faced the opposite direction, eyes staring straight at the front steps. I never moved it. Miss Ruth stopped by that afternoon to check in. I told her I thought someone might have been on the porch the other night. She just smiled politely and said she hadn't heard anything. "Probably just a stray cat," she said. "We get a lot of them around here." I left the next morning. Didn't wait for the weekend. Drove home with that strange weight in my chest, the kind you get when you know something almost happened. Sometimes I still look up the address on satellite view just to see if the house is still listed. The last time I checked, the porch light was on in the photo, and the frog statue was missing entirely. Back in 2004, I lived on a quiet cul-de-sac in a Denver suburb, the kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways, and every house had the same square mailbox and trimmed lawn. It was early spring, just warm enough to keep your window cracked at night, and the air still had that dry, leftover chill from winter. I'd just turned 16 and was grounded for something stupid, cutting last period to hang out at the reservoir. My parents weren't harsh, but they were firm. No driving, no TV, no going out until the weekend. So I spent that week mostly in my room, reading or lying on the floor, listening to the radio. It was during that week that I noticed the van. I first saw it on a Tuesday night, parked just beyond the bend in the cul-de-sac, headlights off, engine running. It was one of those older gray utility vans with no side windows, paint chipped along the bottom, no visible logos. I figured it was a contractor or a plumber finishing a job late, even though none of our neighbors were having work done. But then it was there again on Wednesday and Thursday, always after sunset, always parked in the exact same spot. The neighborhood wasn't built for through traffic, just a loop of 20 houses and a narrow entrance road. So for someone to end up parked back near our section 3 nights in a row, that felt off. Thursday night around 10:30, I finally said something to my dad. He stepped outside, walked down a few feet, and tried to get a closer look. But by the time he reached the sidewalk, the van had already backed out and driven off. He didn't say much, just muttered that he'd keep an eye on it, and went back inside. The next night, Friday, I couldn't sleep. I'd started to get that anxious energy, the kind you get when you're convinced something's about to happen, even if you don't know what. I lay there for hours, staring at the red numbers on my clock radio. At 2:47 a.m., I heard the sound of gravel crunching outside. Not tires this time. Footsteps. I froze. The window beside my bed was cracked open, maybe an inch. Through it I could hear the faint shuffle of someone walking slowly, methodically along the sidewalk. I rolled out of bed and crouched near the vent. The heat had just kicked on, humming low beneath the floorboards. I listened closely, trying to count the steps. They stopped near our mailbox. Then a light knock, not on the door, on the window, our living room window. 3 slow taps. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After a minute, I heard the steps again, retreating this time back toward the street. Then the van's engine rumbled to life. By morning, I had convinced myself I'd imagined it. I even thought maybe it was just someone dropping off flyers or kids being dumb. But when my dad checked the driveway security light, he found something stuck in the bushes near the porch. A key. Just a plain silver house key on a metal ring. No tag, no branding, not even a scratch. We called the police that afternoon. A local officer named Sergeant Williams came by and took a look. He asked if we'd seen anyone suspicious. We told him about the van. He didn't seem surprised. There've been reports, he said. Different streets, same pattern. Unmarked vans, slow passes. Sometimes people get out and knock. Usually they leave nothing. But once in a while they leave something behind. He said the key didn't match any house on record in our development. No prints on it either. That night my dad stayed up in the living room with the porch light on. Nothing happened. The van never came back. But the next week, someone else on the next block over reported their side gate open in the morning. 2 houses had packages go missing. One neighbor, an older man who lived alone, said he found his front door unlocked wide open, but nothing taken. A few of us got new locks installed. My dad upgraded the porch camera. I still don't know what the key was for. We never found a lock it matched. I kept it for a while, tucked in the back of a desk drawer until we moved 2 years later. And even now, when I hear that hollow clink of metal against metal, like keys in someone's hand, I still get that feeling in my chest, that quiet, sharp awareness, like you're being chosen, and you don't know why. I don't usually talk about this. There's no clean way to explain it without sounding paranoid, or like you've let something crawl too deep into your thoughts. But I remember it all clearly. Back in 2016, I lived alone in a ground-floor apartment near campus, one of those cheaply built tan brick complexes with thin walls and air that always smelled faintly like boiled broccoli and disinfectant. My classes were heavy that semester, so I spent most nights at my desk coding into the early morning headphones on lights low. Unit 1A was directly across the hall. The guy who lived there had moved in maybe 2 weeks before I started noticing things. I only saw him once or twice, late 20s, pale, always in a black hoodie and jeans that looked too clean for someone renting that cheap. He never made eye contact. His door stayed closed. At first, it was the noise that caught my attention. Not yelling or music, just footsteps. Careful, deliberate pacing, back and forth. Always between 2 and 3 a.m. You could feel it more than hear it, like weight shifting on old floorboards. One night around 5 11:40. I took my headphones off and sat in silence, listening. The sound stopped abruptly. Then came 3 soft knocks, not at my door, but his. I peeked through the peephole. A man I didn't recognize stood outside 1A. Tall, thin, wearing a ball cap and a gray windbreaker. He didn't knock again, just stood there staring at the door as if waiting for a signal. Eventually, he left. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a friend, maybe a food delivery gone to the wrong door. But the next night it happened again. Different man, same time, same knock. Over the course of 10 days, this pattern repeated. Every night between 2:30 and 2:50, someone came. They never knocked more than once. They never spoke. Sometimes they'd leave right away. Sometimes they'd wait a little while just staring at the door of 1A. One night I got brave and cracked my door open. Not all the way, just a few inches. I caught a whiff of something. Not body odor, not smoke. Something sterile and bitter like old plastic left out in the rain. The man standing outside 1A that night wasn't facing the door. He was standing sideways, his head tilted toward the hallway light, like he was listening to it buzz. He didn't move until I shut my door again. I started logging the visit's time description behavior. The only thing consistent was the timing, always within the same 20-minute window. By the 8th night, I decided to report it. The property manager brushed me off, said if no one was causing damage, there wasn't much they could do. But 2 days later, a detective came by. Officer Lyman, middle-aged, calm, the kind of guy who makes you feel like he already knows more than he's saying. He asked if I'd seen any of the visitors go into the apartment. I said no. They always just stood outside. Then he asked if I'd ever heard the door to 1A open. I realized I hadn't, not once. Lyman nodded like he expected that. Said they'd been keeping tabs on the unit for a while. Wouldn't say why. After that visit, the hallway felt different. I started leaving a shoe against my door at night, not for security, just so I'd hear if someone tried the knob. On the 12th night, no one came. Then again, on the 13th. I should have felt relief, but the silence was worse. It felt like the pause between lightning and thunder, like something had moved on but not far. That Saturday, just before sunset, I heard heavy movement in the hall. I opened my door and saw the apartment manager standing outside 1A with a locksmith. They had received a maintenance request from that unit, but the key hadn't worked. I watched as the lock was popped open and the door swung in. The unit was completely empty. No furniture, no boxes, no trash, no dust. Just a single office chair in the middle of the room facing the blank wall. The carpet didn't even have indentations where anything might have been sitting. No signs of life at all. The manager looked confused, mumbled something about a lease, and left. That night, no one came. The next morning, I found a piece of white paper slid halfway under my door. No writing. Just a drawn symbol, something like a square with a diagonal line through it and a small black dot in the corner. I moved out the next week. Sometimes I dream about that hallway. It's always dim, the carpet wet beneath my feet, and I'm walking toward 1A. I never get there, and I never hear the door open. But I always wake up right at 2:47. I've spent most of my adult life fixing things that broke where they shouldn't have, blown tires on the side of interstates, dead batteries in truck stops 200 miles from anywhere. You get used to long, dark drives, and the way the road hums different after midnight. There's a rhythm to it. But sometimes that rhythm breaks, and you don't realize you've crossed into something off until it's already behind you, still watching. It was just after 2:30 in the morning when I left a job site north of Tonopah, heading south toward Beatty, with a thermos full of stale coffee and a radio tuned to silence. The desert out there flattens the world. The headlights hit scrub and stone, and then nothing, just black space so wide it makes your chest tighten. About halfway between Goldfield and Lida Junction, I saw the flashers. Hazards blinking on the right shoulder, barely visible until I was almost on top of them. 2 men were standing beside a white hatchback, waving their arms in that frantic, exaggerated way that usually means something bad's happened. I slowed instinctively, that mechanic's reflex, but the second I got close enough to see their faces, something felt off. One of them was grinning too wide, like he'd just been told a joke. The other stood stiff, arms at his sides like a wax figure waiting for direction. And the car, it was spotless. Not a scratch, no steam, no popped hood, no reason for them to be out here at all. I rolled past at maybe 30, watching in my rear view, as the man with the grin dropped his hands and just stared. No attempt to follow, no motion at all. I remember the hairs on my arms standing up even before I heard the rever. Their headlights flared behind me, engine howling as the hatchback peeled onto the road and surged forward. They came up fast, way too fast, riding my bumper with their brights on. I switched lanes, so did they. I sped up to 60, then 70. Still there. Close enough that I could make out 2 shapes in the front seats, neither moving, both facing straight ahead. I grabbed my phone, one hand still on the wheel, and punched in 911 with a thumb that kept slipping. Dispatch picked up after 2 rings, a calm voice asking if I needed fire, medical, or police. I gave them the highway number mile marker and told them I was being followed. Hard. I don't know what I expected, maybe for them to drop back the second they saw me talking to someone. But they didn't. If anything, they got bolder. The car swerved left, then right, trying to box me in. I kept telling myself it was just scare tactics, but every time I looked in the mirror, those faces stayed the same. Expressionless like mannequins with one job. Dispatch told me to keep driving and not engage, that help was en route. But out there en route can mean 10 minutes or 30 depending on how many other things are on fire in Nevada that night. They tried to run me off twice. First on a curve, nudging close enough that I could feel the air shift. Then again near a turnout, where the guy on the passenger side leaned halfway out the window and pointed not at me, but past me, like he knew what was ahead. I stayed locked on the center line tires, humming stomach-turning knots. Then all at once, the blue and red flashers lit the sky. Not behind me, ahead. 2 cruisers angled across the highway with doors open and troopers standing in the beam of their headlights. The hatchback slammed its brakes and veered hard into the sand. One of the men jumped out and took off into the sagebrush. The other was slower, less panicked. He stepped out like he had nowhere else to be and didn't care who saw his face. They got them both eventually. The car had been stolen out of Reno 3 nights earlier. Inside, they found zip ties, rope gloves, and a handgun tucked under the passenger seat. No luggage, no plates, just 2 men who'd been using staged breakdowns to lure in help or maybe chase what didn't stop. Afterward, I had to fill out reports and answer a dozen quiet questions in the glow of patrol headlights. The officers kept their voices low, maybe because of the hour, or maybe because they didn't want to admit how close things had come to going sideways. I still think about what would have happened if I'd pulled over, if I'd rolled down the window, if I'd let my habit of helping win out over the wrong kind of silence. That was the last one I'll share tonight. Looking back at these stories, the gas stations, the cabins, the side roads, and empty motel lots, I think the thread that runs through them isn't just fear, it's recognition. Something in the air that tells you without words that something's wrong. A glance that lasts too long. A hallway that shouldn't be dark. A silence that doesn't sit right. Most of us ignore those feelings. We rationalize them. We laugh them off. But the truth is, sometimes they're the only warning we get. Not all the people in these stories were unlucky. Some walked away. Some even helped stop something worse. But none of them were the same afterward. That's what unease does. It gets into the quiet spaces and stays there waiting. Maybe that's why we tell these stories before bed. Not to scare ourselves, but to remember the edges, to feel the shape of the dark without having to step too far into it. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If you've enjoyed these stories, I'd love for you to follow the channel, share it with someone you trust, and subscribe so you don't miss the next night. And tell me, have you ever passed a stranger on the road and felt something in your gut say, "Keep driving, I'll be reading. Good night."